Good morning and welcome to another Seize the Day. I'm glad that we're having an opportunity to gather together today. Trust you guys have had a really good night's sleep, waking up ready, refreshed to begin a new day. Um, really brisk morning, sun's out, feeling good. Um, can you believe today is February the 1st? February 1st. What happened in January? It just flew by. And before you know, it's going to be Valentine's Day, and hopefully we'll start seeing things warming up here. For those of you who are in other parts of the country and some even in the world, yeah, maybe weather's a little bit different. But here we had a pretty good snowstorm this past week, and it laid everybody a little low. So I'm grateful that you're here. Love our Seize the Days gives us an opportunity to just get into the Word a little bit deeper. So as you begin to, sign in this morning, it'd be awesome if maybe you guys just put where you're from. It's always good, I think, when people are watching online to get a sense of where people are from, and maybe if it's warm or cold, and just throw it out there. So it'd be a good way to become a little bit more acquainted with some of the names that we see each and every day. We've been in a study now on the Sermon on the Mount. I've called it Schooled, and because it's time to go back to some of the basic things that Jesus has been sharing with us, things that are important for us to know. Um, uh, it just occurred to me, like, maybe see a little bit of a different background. Today I'm in my office, and here at the Greenland campus in New Hampshire, and um, so it's a pleasure to be here. I had some early morning things to do, so I just decided I would broadcast from my office this morning. Um, okay, so schooled, going back and allowing Jesus to give us some real lessons in discipleship. If you read Matthew chapters 5 through 7, it is an awesome collection of Jesus's teachings that really help to disciple us about what it means to be a part of this kingdom of heaven. You know, one of the things that Jesus has said recently in a text that we've been looking at is Jesus made a very clear statement to you and me that he's going beyond the letter of the law and wants to plunge deeply into the matters of the heart. So when Jesus now begins to speak to us a little bit more about what it means to be a citizen in this kingdom of heaven, then you begin to realize that Jesus is going into a much deeper interpretation of the law and the prophets. I hope by now you recognize that the law and the prophets is a phrase that refers back to the Hebrew scriptures, and it's the equivalent of our Old Testament. So Jesus is saying, when you look back at all of the law and the prophets, don't think that I've come to abolish them. I've come to fulfill them. And not one letter, not the smallest letter, not the least stroke of a pen is going to pass away until all is accomplished. So Jesus is giving us a high view of Scripture, right? He's letting you and me come to this deeper understanding of what it really means to be a part of the kingdom of heaven. And right after he says this, giving, like I said, a high view of the authority of Scripture, he then turns around and he says to you and me that anyone who teaches or practices anything contrary to what this law of God, right, what the Scriptures are teaching, he says will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. And he says, and those who practice and teach, the Scriptures and its intent to others, he says, they will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. And then he added this. He says, for your righteousness must exceed the righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees. Well, the scribes and the Pharisees were the teachers of the law. The scribes and the Pharisees were the ones who are leading the charge. They were the models for the community. And now Jesus says, your righteousness must exceed theirs. Well, how are we going to do that? Well, Jesus is going to tell us, right? He's going to show us that the way you do that is not by piling on more rules and regulations. It's getting at the heart of what God has been trying to say to his people for generation after generation after generation. That's why, so far as we've looked, right, we saw in this case with thou shalt not kill, right, thou shalt not murder. God says, can I tell you what the intent behind that really was? That what the real fulfillment of all this was about? It's to show you that the acts of murder, rage, anger, factions, all those things, where do they come from? They come from deep seated inside one's heart. So he says, so you do realize that when you're angry with your brother, you've killed him. And if you've been on the short end of someone's, seething kind of anger, it's not a fun place to be, right? We're not just talking about, this occasional anger or temper. The interesting thing, maybe this is a good way to illustrate this. I don't know how many of you have taken language classes before, but in the Greek language, there are a number of different tenses that you can speak of in terms of things that are present, things that are that they would start and stop. There are tenses where you would speak of things that it's like a once and for all. It's done. And so in the Greek here, when we think about it, says if you're angry with your brother, it's in a present active participle. So it's speaking of something that is ongoing. So it's not just somebody that might lose a temper occasionally. We're talking about someone this is seething, and it says what's going to come from that. You see, nothing good is going to come from that. That's why numerous places in the scriptures, right, will tell us that you don't repay evil for evil. The only way you overcome evil is with good. And sometimes when you're doing the good and someone's doing the evil, it seems like they're getting away with it. This is just isn't fair. Well, in this world, it's not going to be fair. That's the whole point, right? This world is broken. The standards of this world are upside down. So if we're looking for that level of justice in this world, think again. Otherwise, why would Jesus come to bring about this sense of righteousness? Because we're not finding it. And so consequently, when you look at these passages, you're going to find that Jesus is constantly plunging deeply into the heart of matters here. And especially when it came to the 10 Commandments, that this community to whom he's speaking, they held in high regard. The books of Moses, right? The Pharisees were constantly trying to interpret one's obedience to these laws in minute ways. Like when it says, like, thou shalt not keep the Sabbath. Well, and you should refrain from all kinds of work. And so they define work in the minutest ways, from the lighting of a candle, that's work. And they would have other people come so they could treat everybody else around them, really poorly, but as long as they were keeping their Sabbath. Did they not realize why keeping the Sabbath was there in the first place? A time for us to commune with God, to be reminded of all of his faithfulness towards us. And yet and on the Sabbath day, I am treating others around me like dirt, or having no regard for them whatsoever. So then you see, at that juncture, what's really at the forefront of all that I'm doing? What's at the forefront is precisely the fact that you and I are trying to judge how good I am, my righteousness, by the way in which I'm keeping my checklist. Where God is saying, no. The way I judge righteousness is by looking at the intent of a man's heart. That's why I'm telling you, on one level, you could turn around and say, hey, I haven't killed anybody. But if we're harboring that sense of malice towards someone, we Jesus is saying, in effect, yeah, you are. And if you've ever been on the receiving end of that, you know how terrible that feels. How words can demean people and really rob them of a future. So today we're going to take another look at what this means. And the interesting thing that I want you to see is that this idea that Jesus is calling us to um, a greater righteousness is because what Jesus is doing for you and me now is saying, let me tell you what the real intention was behind these 10 commandments. I'm going to fill this out for you. That's why Jesus says, I've come and all of this is going to be accomplished. All of this is going to be revealed. I am not going to abolish the law. I'm going to show you what it looks like when it's fulfilled. And so in Jesus, we see this person who is without sin, demonstrating an obedience to God. And he does it taking on the form of a man, right? So the same limitations that you and I are having now, Jesus experienced those. Um, so so now let's if this is about the greater righteousness, and that's what I hope that you're getting from these examples, let's take another look as we go from the sixth commandment to the seventh commandment, of the 10, right? Thou shalt not commit adultery. And in doing that, I want to bring to your attention a text here from Matthew chapter 5 and Matthew 5 in verses 27 through 30. So I'm just going to put this full screen so I could read it to you, and then we'll talk a little bit about it. All right? So this is what it says. It says, you have heard that it was said, do not commit adultery. See, here in this passage, what we're discovering, right, is this commandment, thou shalt not commit adultery. This is what was said. He says, but I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, gouge it out and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to go into hell. Now, when you look at this passage, it's pretty it's pretty rough, isn't it? What Jesus is saying to you and to me in this passage, man, we have to sit back and really digest a little bit about what he's saying. So let's with some of the time that we have today, and we'll roll into it again a little bit more tomorrow. But take a look at this passage. And one thing I want you to see here is you do see how it says, you have heard that it was said. So this is referring back to a revelation that God has given to us of his law, right? So you and I now, we are looking at these Old Testament scriptures, and people had received this word as coming from Moses, right? That Moses is telling you and me what God's will is, right? His purposes. Those 10 commandments were given to guide the nation of Israel so that they would stand apart from the nations of which they were going to be living alongside. And he says, you have to be different. You're my people. And so these 10 commandments had everything to do with to guide them, direct them, right? Instruct them, even correct them. And so he says, now you've heard that it was said, do not commit adultery. And like I was sharing with you a few moments ago, people would look at that and say, okay, well, if I'm not sleeping with another woman, then I'm good. I got this covered. But then notice what Jesus says. But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. So, a couple of things I want to point out to you. First, you notice that Jesus says, "But I tell you," that should strike you as a little strange, because here we have the word of God, and now Jesus is going to take this word and he's going to apply it in a much deeper way, expanding what generally people would have said, well, look, it says, "Thou shalt not commit adultery." So if I'm married and I'm sleeping with another woman, um, or I'm sleeping with another man, that is outside the bounds of what God has declared in His Word, right? So I've broken one of those 10 commandments. But Jesus comes along now, and now he's saying he's got something to add to this, and he's gonna expand our understanding of what that commandment was all about. So when Jesus says, "I have not come to abolish, but to fulfill," what Jesus is saying, basically saying, I'm going to give you the full intention, what was lying behind these commandments. But for Jesus to do that, you do notice, right, that he is placing himself in a position that is on the same as God, because God is the one who gave this word to Moses, and now Jesus is saying, "Let me tell you what this really is all about." So Jesus is speaking with an authority that is only legitimate if he truly is the Son of God. Otherwise, he's just another teacher. Otherwise, he's just, another theologian that's out there, preaching his brand of truth. But Jesus is saying, no, no, you've heard that it was said, but I'm telling you. And now he begins to divulge something even deeper. This is why I said you do realize on a number of levels why it was important in the first 4 chapters of Matthew, where Matthew is establishing that Jesus truly is the promised Redeemer. He is this anointed one. He is the Messiah. He is the Christ who has come to do his Father's bidding. He is now the Son of the Most High. He takes on flesh. He existed before time began. It says, if you follow along, like in the first chapter of Hebrews, in chapter 2 and verse 2, it says that he made all things. John, first chapter of John, the first opening verses give you an indication that this was the word that was in the beginning, that was with God, was God. And I pointed out a couple of times, that when you read that verse, when it says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, the Word was God." Well, in the beginning speaks of eternity. Was with God speaks of, a distinct personality, right? And he was God speaks of divinity. So here in the opening lines of John's gospel, we find one who is eternal, personal, and divine. And then you go down to verse 14 in John 1, and it says, "And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And we beheld him as the one and only Son of God, full of grace and truth." So Jesus here in Matthew 5, as we will see in these other texts that are coming, he's speaking with authority. He's saying, let me give to you the real understanding of what these verses were really meant to be. It wasn't just a box for people to check and say, well, I haven't done that, so that means I'm really good. God's saying, no, this is a matter of the heart. And why do I say that? Well, look at our text. He says, "I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her." Where? In his heart. Now, remember we said in verse 27 here, it says, "Do not commit adultery." Well, adultery is usually understood as having sex outside of marriage, right? Well, now notice here in verse 28, he says, "Anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart." Well, wait a minute. We just expanded this definition. Now, Jesus is making it clear that he's not limiting his commandments to married people, but speaking of sexual sin in general. You catch that? There is this like little shift in the text, and it would, I think it behooves us to kind of point that out. So it's not just about married people. Now Jesus is talking about sexual sin in general. And let me go back to this one text where he says he looks at a woman lustfully. Remember earlier I shared with you how in Greek the tenses in the way in which we use words, they're a little bit more precise in the Greek language. So, for instance, in English, if we say he looked at me, well, look could mean a glance, right? He looked at me, or a look could also mean like he looked at me, meaning he's like he was gazing, he was staring at me. It's the same word. It has everything to do with the context in which we use that word. It's the tone sometimes that we will say that word. Well, he looked at me like he was checking me out. Well, see, that's exactly what this is saying. It's not just a casual look. The force of the participle in this text is one that speaks of continuous action. So, look, we're grown-ups here, right? Many of you ladies, you know exactly what that look feels like. You know exactly how someone is like practically undressing you with their eyes, and it makes you feel so uncomfortable. And if you're around somebody like that, it makes you feel uncomfortable. Like you're like, man, seriously? And you see this, all around us, right? There is this staring, there is this desire to what? To in your mind, you've already like transgressed that line. He says here, if anyone looks at a woman lustfully, he's already committed adultery in his heart. So let's take this another step then. All right. So I'm kind of building up this little argument. One, you realize that Jesus, what he has to say is on par with what God declared in the Ten Commandments. So when God gave us the Ten Commandments, Jesus comes along now and said, yeah, but let me tell you what was really behind that. And it's not a mystery, because God was always not, he wasn't about just putting these passages, on stone, like, these texts on stone. He wanted these texts to live in a person's heart. If you've been following along this week, yesterday, I referenced a passage from Jeremiah 31, where God says, I'm going to do this new work. No longer will someone, have to point to like these texts. He says, because I'm going to write my law on your minds. I'm going to put them in your heart. And then you begin to realize, oh, this has everything to do with the desires that rage deep within me. And right now, we could have displaced affections, right? Our affections could be all over the place. It could be all about my pleasures, my wants. And God is saying, no, no, no. If you're going to be a part of this a citizen of this kingdom of heaven, you have to have a greater righteousness than that of the Pharisees and the scribes, who are just looking at a little checkbox to say, okay, I'm not doing that sin, or I'm not doing that sin. God says, no, no, no. Let me tell you the way God looks at these things. God is looking at the intentions of a man's heart. And so here is this lustful stare, right? That God is saying, why are you doing that? What is it that's going inside of you? And this is why when you see in here, he says, he's committed adultery with her in his heart. So, right, this is an internal thing now. This is not just a matter of the outward actions, physical actions. Now this is internal. It has everything to do with getting at the heart and the root of one's heart. Here's another thing. Where is this taking place? I know I said it already, right? In his heart. But what I mean by that is like, where is this in his heart means it's something internal, right? That means that all of this is going on where? In here. It's this is being played on the screens of one's mind. And that could happen for women, that could happen for men, right? It doesn't matter. It says it, Jesus is applying this passage to men, but there is ample places in the scriptures. This is a sin that affects all of us, right? You're not doing it by yourself. So here in this text, he's saying that this is taking place inside your heart. So it's something internal, which means that this has everything to do with my own desires, but it's also being played out in the screens that are taking place in my mind. So think about that for a moment. God is judging us on what is going on internal, privately, in the confines of our own head. You catch that? So what about this excuse that people often get, saying, well, hey, I'm not hurting anybody. This is something private. Is there a part of your life then that is absent from God's purview? One of my favorite texts is a text from Jeremiah in chapter 25, where he says, is there any place a man can hide that I cannot see him? Am I a God who is near and not a God who is far off? Or in Hebrews, when it says that one day we will stand before him who examines one's heart and everything is laid bare. No, you see, this idea that somehow or another we can section off our lives and say, okay, this is my spiritual side, this is my regular life side. Yeah, that doesn't work. Not according to Jesus, because Jesus is judging a man's heart. Jesus is judging the intentions of his thoughts. Can you understand now why, like in a text like Romans chapter 12, verse 2, where it says, do not be conformed to the pattern of this world any longer, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, so that you might prove what God's will is, that which is good, acceptable, perfect. The transformation of one's mind is because God knows if I get you thinking right, your motivations and actions will then ensue. But if my mind is not right, if my heart and its emotions are displaced, then the fruit that's going to come from that, yeah, for some, it's going to be physically in crossing these boundaries of adultery. But Jesus says you've already crossed that boundary, a long time ago. So let me just rewrap here, because we're going to come back again to this tomorrow. First of all, Jesus is speaking on a par with God. Should say to you and me, this is something of the authority that he is bringing then to his teaching that far exceeds any of his contemporaries, and of which is part of what it means when it says that God was sending his son. The other side of this is that you realize then that the intentions of one's heart, the thoughts of one's mind, God is saying, that's all open to me. And I'm telling you right now, he says, I see it all. And that is a transgression then of these laws that I gave to you. Just like when I said, you read, thou shalt not kill. And I tell you, if you're angry with your brother, like that seething, continuous anger that you're venting towards someone without that sense of being reconciled, you do realize that you've transgressed my law. Because it's showing that you're not walking in harmony with me. Here in this whole text on adultery, he's saying the same thing. This is internal. And you have to fix that. How do you fix that? Aha! That's why we need Jesus. That's why his righteousness has to become part of ours. That's why that spirit now has to dwell inside of us to mold us and conform us more and more into his image. How else is that going to happen? All the struggle and self-help on our own, yeah, you can't do it by yourself. If you could, then why would you need Jesus? Why would he have to come and give his life a ransom for the sins of man? Because if you could do it, then it wasn't necessary for God's Son to come and die. But there is a sin problem that can only be addressed by the grace of God in Christ Jesus, because he makes us alive. He raises us up. He seats us in the heavenly places. And all because God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish but have everlasting life. Come on. That was worth getting up for this morning. This is awesome. These things are hard teachings, but if we just meditate on them enough, you recognize that God is going to take away all this churchianity, all this plastic kind of spirituality that we bring to the table, and he wants to deal with the real issues of what's going on inside of us. And when that happens, my friends, you and I, we become the salt of the earth. We become the light of the world. We're change agents. We're ambassadors of hope. Otherwise, you may as well just go out there and eat, drink, and be merry, because you only have so much time. And then one day you're going to stand before a holy God and say, what'd you do with my son? No, my friends, this is the best way to live. Fix your eyes on Jesus and run this race with great endurance. We'll come back at this again tomorrow. So much that enables us to seize the day today. So I trust that you'll do so with the reminder that God is good all the time. Lord willing, we'll see each other again tomorrow. God bless. Really thankful for this community. God bless you guys.